Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. So we're going to talk today about the outlook politically in the United States over the next couple of election cycles. And we're going to have two very different conversations in this first segment. First, I'm going to talk about what I believe is an overtly black and white approach to figuring out what the general strategy of the left should be over the next couple of election cycles based on what happened Tuesday. The second piece of it is going to be very tactical, actually. It's going to be very much about talking points and how to fight on very specific issues, the messaging of the right. Both of these are important, but let's start with the bigger picture first. There are two conflicting interpretations that are being repeated uncritically, in a sense, about what happened on Tuesday. Now, what happened on Tuesday was very bad for Democrats, and it bodes very poorly. It does not signal that 2022 is going to be great for Democrats, and maybe even 2024, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But one reaction to what happened Tuesday is, whoa, Democrats went too far left. India Walton, socialist in Buffalo, New York, got defeated easily by a write-in candidate. Democrats need to come back to the middle. The reaction by many to what happened in Virginia, Terry McAuliffe losing there to Glenn Youngkin after Ralph Northam won by 9 in 2017. Democrat won by 9. Now Republican ended up winning by a couple of points. The reaction there has been, Democrats need to go further to the left. This centrist establishment, milquetoast Terry McAuliffe, that's not what is going to lead Democrats to victory in the future. And the truth is the world is just more complicated than that. And unfortunately, partially because of the way corporate media is structured and functions, and partially because we have a tendency to want simple one-factor explanations for things, a lot of these false black-white dichotomies are not going to lead to any success for the left, which ultimately is what I care about. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one headline from Common Dreams, which says, progressives on the Virginia loss. Corporate Democrats have only themselves to blame. It's conservative Dems who've ensured that every day for the last several months, the headlines are about how we aren't delivering paid leave, prescription drug reform, elder care, or voting rights. And that the problem is that if the Democratic candidate had been much more to the left in Virginia, Virginia would have been held by Democrats. And we're going to link to this article, and you can analyze it and think about it. Contrasting narrative is about socialist India Walton in Buffalo was a bad idea. Incumbent Brown declares Buffalo mayor write-in win over socialist India Walton. This is a New York Post article. New York Post is sort of like Fox News, owned by News Corporation. The incumbent Democratic mayor of Buffalo, running as a write-in candidate, declared victory Tuesday night as he held a nearly 20-point lead over his Democratic Party opponent. India Walton, a socialist backed by many high-profile progressives, refused to concede to Mayor Brown in the highly publicized contest until her campaign sees all the votes. And this has led to a number of arguments that the problem is that that's too far left. Now, here's the reality. Both are true. Both are true. How can both be true? Well, it is true that socialism isn't very popular in the United States. And right now, there aren't many socialists. And that could be a factor in Buffalo. It's plausible that in Buffalo, one of the reasons that India Walton didn't win and lost to a write-in candidate is that there's not that many socialists in Buffalo. And we learned from the 2020 Democratic Party that Democratic primary rather, ideas that seem popular on Twitter and Reddit are not actually as popular among the average Democratic voter. That is true in a sense. And India Walton being a socialist could be a factor. Now, some are saying race is a factor, although the incumbent is black. And there's all sorts of different arguments being made. But at least when it comes to the Buffalo mayoral race, it doesn't seem that being a socialist helped India Walton. So that's a consideration. At the same time, Terry McAuliffe was a milquetoast, uninspiring, centrist Democrat in Virginia. And that was a factor there. There were also other factors in Virginia. The fact that the election for a long period of time was run as a sort of referendum on Trump when Trump wasn't even running, and Youngkin was sort of careful not to denounce nor embrace Donald Trump. So that was a factor. There were a lot of different factors. The fact that the right very successfully played on fear and anger over critical race theory, which isn't even being taught to kids in Virginia. Okay, but the common thread in both elections is that voters were motivated by fear and anger to vote for someone other than Terry McAuliffe in Virginia and India Walton in Buffalo, New York. Fear and anger motivate people more effectively than, hey, we're going to do green energy, or we're going to replace some police with social workers, or whatever the case may be. In Buffalo, it was sort of traditional Democrat Byron Brown who did it and said, you don't want that. You don't want that. This is safer. That's dangerous. You should be afraid of that. In Virginia, it was radical Republican Glenn Youngkin. Different populations. Virginia is more of a 50-50 state overall. Buffalo is I believe Joe Biden got like 77% of the vote, or no, maybe it was 67. Joe Biden won Buffalo easily in 2020, but it's more Democratic establishment rather than like progressive socialist Democrats. So yes, Democrats ran a terrible campaign in Virginia focused on Trump, who wasn't really involved. McAuliffe could have won if the climate were actually, we are running against Trump the way Biden did. That's totally plausible. We'd be having a different conversation right now. But the takeaway here is the Democratic Party electorate is more centrist than it seems on Twitter and Reddit. We learned that in the 2020 primary. But at the same time, there is no one explanation as to what Democrats need to do. And the first mistake, if we even want to have this conversation, is we can't restrict ourselves to an analysis that is, to win, Democrats need to move to the middle, or to win, Democrats need to move to the left. There is not one thing Democrats need to do. And in mayoral elections versus state Senate and rep versus Senate and House of Representatives, governor and president, there is not one answer. And unless we can first agree there is not one answer, we're probably not going to get more productive conversations, unfortunately. So let's now get from strategy and approach to tactics. I got a really interesting email from Eric and Colleen. I think Eric and Colleen are a couple that watch the show. And what Eric and Colleen wrote to me about was the new Democratic talking points. They seem to understand that Democrats have been falling to Republicans in many cases because Republicans much more effectively play on fear and anger, and that Republican talking points just naturally lend themselves more to that. And Eric and Colleen wrote to me and said, David, you know, if we want to develop on the left the same motivating fear and anger that the Republican Party does, we need to change our messaging. Now, Eric and Colleen say it doesn't even matter if our messaging is true. Republicans lie all the time. So my question to you as I go through these possible talking points that Eric and Colleen suggested is, how do we feel about using talking points that we know in some cases aren't true? Is that taking the low road and we don't want to do it? But here are the new talking points that Eric and Colleen suggest should be repeated and repeated and repeated in 2022 and 2024. On abortion, okay, these are hypothetical talking points. On abortion, Republicans want to force you to have babies, and they will create a dangerous and expensive black market of back alley abortions. It's not really an exaggeration, actually. It's using maybe hyperbolic language, but that one isn't wrong. On guns, Republicans will make it so easy to get guns that every criminal will be armed, and many of those will be armed with semi-automatics outfitted with high-capacity magazines. Every criminal will be armed. It's an exaggeration, but certainly the right wants to make it really easy to get guns. On immigration, Republicans will shut down the borders. Women and children who are fleeing violence are going to die at the border of disease and starvation or be sent back to death in their home countries. It's hyperbolic, but it plays on fear and it plays on anger. Education. Republicans will take control away from school boards and implement a federal government curriculum. It won't be based in science. It won't be based in accurate historical realities. It's going to be alternative facts, lies, and Christianity, and they will impose it on your children. Okay. On the pandemic, Republicans will not allow enforcement of any safety measure. They will ban mask requirements. They will ban vaccine requirements, and they are going to allow this or a future pandemic to run rampant. They will allow innocent Americans to keep dying just to avoid implementing any regulations. On deregulation, Republicans are going to let poison and sewage pour into our water systems. They're going to build more fossil fuel plants near your homes, and there will be more respiratory disease and cancer as a result. On inequality, Republicans will allow wealth concentration to deepen, and it will destroy the middle class. That one seems just pretty sober, actually. On taxes, Republicans will continue to allow the rich and corporations to get away with paying no taxes or close to it. The rich will get richer, concentration of power will become worse, and it will crush the middle class. And lastly, on infrastructure, the talking point proposed by Eric and Colleen is our infrastructure, roads, electrical grid, military, educational system, it will be bankrupt thanks to the rich and corporations paying almost no taxes. This is more hyperbolic language than Democrats and the left tend to use. It's mostly accurate with some exaggerations. How do you feel about it? Do Democrats and does the left need to find talking points to generate that exact same type of fear and anger that the right does with out and out lies? And if the answer is yes, the left needs to do that, does the left need to do it without exaggeration and without hyperbole, or is it okay to do it the way Eric and Colleen are suggesting? Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what talking points you think the left should adopt. You can find me on Twitter at @dpacman, and we'll be back with more right after this. One of our sponsors is Blinkist, who's been supporting the David Pakman Show longer than any other sponsor. Blinkist is the app that lets you listen to or read an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. Blinkist is the way to absorb those books you can't make time for. Blinkist takes top nonfiction titles, pulls out the book's key takeaways and insights, and gives it to you in the form of a text or audio explainer that you can consume in 15 minutes. With Blinkist, now you actually do have time to learn about all the things you've been wanting to tackle. On the Blinkist app, I just listened to This Is Your Mind on Plants by the great Michael Pollan. Super interesting, the history of caffeine and so many other things. Blinkist has you covered on podcasts too. Blinkist takes long episodes of popular podcasts and distills them into audio you can listen to in 15 minutes. With Blinkist, you can become knowledgeable about so many different things. You can have conversations with people about more topics. Blinkist makes you more well-rounded. Try Blinkist for free and get 25% off a subscription. Go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. The link is down below. You can join the David Pakman Show subreddit at davidpakman.com/Reddit, REDDIT. Nearly, what are we up to? It must be about 34,000 of our viewers and listeners subscribed there. A couple of interesting posts and discussions I spotted this morning. One is from user DL1943, who says, does anyone know where I can find explanations for the JFK Jr. stuff? I'm totally fascinated by conspiracy theories and always have been. Obviously, I do not believe in QAnon or really any straight-up conspiracies, but I'd like to hear this whole JFK Jr. stuff laid out by the people who believe it, not regurgitated through media articles. Does anyone know of any publicly viewable sites where the Q people post about this stuff or discuss it? Yeah, so listen, my understanding is that a bunch of, I guess, QAnon-type people believe that JFK Jr., who was killed in a plane crash in 1999, I think it was, is actually still alive. Some of them believed that he was going to be running alongside Trump at some point, or was in 2020 in some kind of secret way, or there's a million different iterations of this. And then others believed that he was going to reappear I guess near the grassy knoll in Dallas, Texas, a couple of days ago, and they actually gathered there. That's sort of like my best understanding of it. And I don't know if there's any other specific reason why it's JFK Jr. There was some confusion because a lot of the very same people who believe that and are part of QAnon are also anti-vax. And a really funny thing seems to be in one, I don't remember if it was in the comments on a Rumble post or some right-wing enclave, I could tell from the comments that there were people confused between this JFK Jr. conspiracy and the fact that Bobby Kennedy Jr. is anti-vax. And it was just like a whole confusion. It was almost like Qception, I would call it, where even the Q people were confused about the concatenated conspiracy theories. Okay, anyway, so that's my best understanding, but you might be able to find something clearer from someone who actually believes it. User MGSF Departed posted to the subreddit why Youngkin's, at the time it was probable, but now we know it's victory. Why Youngkin's victory needs to be taken seriously. And they write, Youngkin had absolutely nothing to run on, nothing of actual concrete substance, just culture war noises and a whole lot of old-fashioned lies. He's still ahead by over 100,000 votes. He ran all of the best, worst hits from ending critical race theory, which doesn't exist in Virginia, reinstating family values, a meaningless talking point, attacking teachers, and using things like critical race theory as a blanket excuse to cut funding meant to raise wages for teachers. And the idiots ate it up. I'm sure you've already seen the bumpkin getting interviewed who said, I don't care much for CRT, while on the other side of his mouth adding he has no clue what it is. It doesn't matter. It's a non-issue, and it's one idiots, I guess they mean, cling to. The reality is simple. With or without the BS culture war noises, these idiots were all going to turn out in droves for Youngkin regardless. They're pissed, and more importantly, they're galvanized. They've been bashed over what's left of their brains multiple times into thinking their voices weren't heard, and now they're turning out in droves. It's not yet known if Democrats just didn't turn out or if the numbers were not in their favor, but this was a win for the GQP. And if it really is an indicator of what's to come next year, we're in trouble. If Youngkin does emerge victorious, which he did, and enact the policies he's trying to, or tries to enact them, then the left needs to shine a spotlight on it and use that to light the necessary fires under our asses. Because the GQP has gone full Stone Age on us. And if people remain apathetic, combined with voter suppression, we're going to see a lot. This won't stay in Virginia. This is absolutely correct. There's just, I have so little to add other than I did add on to it in the first two segments on today's show. The answer is not always run further to the left. The answer is not always run further to the middle. It depends on the race. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but the one-size-fits-all approach that the right is implementing is the one we have to fight, and that is fear and anger over things that are completely untrue, that are being exaggerated or misstated or simply misunderstood by Republican voters. And it's really, really hard to fight that. I don't have the answer. I proposed a couple possibilities earlier, but I don't have the answer. But I think this assessment is spot on. Anybody downplaying the effect or the significance of Tuesday's elections for Democrats for 2022, even 2024. You could have a big wake-up call. It's going to be very ugly. Join the discussion at davidpakman.com/Reddit. There is a new report. It's an extremely disturbing report, which found that at least 8 Republicans who were at the January 6th rally have been elected to office. Now, these are not necessarily people who were participating in the riot. But these are folks who were at the rally on January 6th. Huffington Post article. At least 8 Republicans who were elected at the rally just got elected to office. And even more attendees of the rally that turned into the riot will likely be on the ballot in 2022. Although most have claimed they didn't breach the U.S. Capitol on that day, all were participants in the demonstration leading up to the attack, standing alongside extremists to take part in the finale of a months-long anti-democratic campaign to falsely claim that then-President Donald Trump didn't really lose 2020. Their victories on Tuesday are a possible sign of things to come. HuffPost previously identified 57 state and local Republican officials who attended the rally, many of whom will be up for re-election and likely will win next year. That these candidates enjoy the support of the wider Republican Party and are winning elections does not bode well for American democracy. That's an understatement. Showing that one of the country's major political parties, despite some initial gestures at being horrified by the events of January 6th, is almost completely unrepentant over its role in fomenting the historic attack on the Capitol. And why wouldn't they? There have barely been consequences, as I said before. Not only barely consequences for the perpetrators, many of their cases still pending, but no real consequences for the inciters. And some of them are getting rewarded by getting elected. Among the January 6th attendees who won office on Tuesday were two Republicans reelected to the Virginia House of Delegates, Dave LaRock and John McGuire. Marie March, a restaurant owner who bragged about her attendance at the Stop the Steal rally, and who, in a since-deleted Facebook post, warned of a coming civil war, in which she would be willing to fight and die for both her family and small businesses, also won a seat in the Virginia House of Delegates on Tuesday. In city councils across the country, rally attendee Natalie Jangula won a seat in Nampa, Idaho. Christine Eade, who didn't go into the Capitol and later blamed the violence on Antifa, won a seat in Watchung, New Jersey. Charles Osberger also won a seat on the town council of Mansfield, Connecticut. Susan Soloway organized transportation to the rally, won re-election to the Hunterdon County, New Jersey Board of Directors. In Braintree, Massachusetts, a former high school teacher who resigned his position after local activists sent a photo of him outside the Capitol won a seat on the local school committee. It goes on and on and on. This is a really backwards time. Now, just an example of someone elected to give you a sense of the caliber of these people. This is not someone from the rally. This is just an example of a Republican that voters liked enough to elect. This is New Jersey truck driver Edward Durr, who was just elected a Republican state senator. And when he was asked, well, what are you going to do in Trenton? He said, I don't really know. I have no idea. This is who is now in a position of power. Take a look at this.
He chose to sit back and do nothing.
Ed, what's the first thing you're going to do when you get to the Capitol in Trenton?
I really don't know. That's the key factor. I don't know what I don't know. So
that is the key factor.
Will learn what I need to know. And I'm going to guarantee you one thing.
Yeah.
I will be the voice and people will hear me, because if there's one thing people will learn about me, I got a big mouth and I don't shut up. When I want to be heard, I'm going to be heard.
Well, this is not a lot. The host is laughing. This is horrifying, guys.
I will let...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Finish your thought.
Oh, my God.
I was just going to say that I will be that voice for the people, because I chose to sit back.
Oh, man. I wasn't kidding yesterday with my 2030 rant, and the rant sort of was, this week's elections might set the tone for some major Republican wins in 2022, which could include taking control back of the House and Senate. I've already said 2024 with Biden or Harris as the Democratic nominees. It's looking dubious to me. You could see Republicans take the House and Senate in 22 and the White House in 24. And then in 26, Democrats are really going to be up against the wall and Republicans will have continued damaging the environment and the country. It could be a very tough 8 to 10 years for this country. And again, I said this on a stream. There are some people who are mad and some people who agreed. In many blue states, things are going to be fine. This is not blue state elitism and me saying, I don't have to worry because I live in blue states. It's an empirical reality that if you look at the Human Development Index of Massachusetts, it's the same as Norway. Quality of life is like Norway. Connecticut has the HDI ranking of Switzerland. Minnesota, New Hampshire, Connecticut, they have the Human Development Index ranking of Germany and Hong Kong. New York is equivalent to Australia and the Netherlands. In lots of those places, many things are going to be mostly fine. But stuff like pollution and so many others that cross state lines are going to be really bad everywhere. And I still care about people in red states too, that have the equivalent, standard of living of much poorer countries. So could be ugly for a long time. And the last 96 hours aren't pointing in a great direction. Make sure you're following us on Instagram at David Pakman Show. We'll be back right after this short break.
Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com and use the coupon code BETTER21 for a huge discount. Joinpakman.com.
It's great to have back on the program today Brian Klaas, who's an associate professor of global politics at University College London and also author of the new book, Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. Brian, always great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
So, when we think about something like who obtains power in society, we could even narrow it down and say in kind of Western democracies, in capitalist Western democracies, there's a lot of different approaches we can look at. We can look at sort of psychological factors and personality factors about individuals. We can talk about, the leg up that the economic circumstances that one is born into might play as a factor. We can talk about the role of media, so many different things. What are some of the, or maybe the most important filters through which we can start to think about who ends up holding power in society?
Yes, so I think that most of the debate around people in power is like a tip of the iceberg problem, where we tend to focus almost all of our attention on the people who are actually in power, the ones who we can see, right, the top of the iceberg. And the real problem I think we have is underneath the surface, which is the people who don't seek power. And so, you think about like a high school basketball team. You never expect that basketball team to be a representative sample of height in the school, right? There's a certain group of people that are going to try out for the team. The same is obviously true with power. Now, I've looked, the book draws on a wide variety of research from evolutionary biology to neuroscience and psychology and so on. So I started to ask people who study this, is there a power gene? Is there something in us that causes us to seek power? And there is a study that shows a significant correlation between a specific gene and people who end up in power. But we can't say whether that's because they have certain traits, they're more outgoing, they're more affable, whatever. But we do have some evidence that there is some genetic basis to power attainment. And then, of course, you filter that through all the stuff in society where, it's obvious that white men have an easier time getting power in Western democracies, but also that we seek certain things in our rulers. And this ranges from everything from evolutionary psychology, where we look at, why is it that we turn to strong men in times of crises, to this amazing study I found about basically asking children to pick someone to captain their imaginary ship in this computer simulation. And they basically are shown two faces, and there's no other information given. They pick one of the faces to be the captain. What they don't know is that the two faces are the winner and the runner-up of the French parliamentary elections. And with astonishing accuracy, they tend to pick the winner, which reflects this horrible truth that often we have such superficial assessments when we pick leaders. So there are dozens of reasons why this happens, but I think we have to acknowledge the problem and the self-selection that goes into power before we can actually fix it.
With some of these things, there would be sort of a legitimate question to ask about, it's sort of like a chicken egg thing, and I'll explain what I mean. When we think about the alleged corrupting influence of power, it's often said that absolute power corrupts. But is there something about corrupt people who are already corrupt predisposed to put themselves in those positions that kind of reverses the causation?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two ways. The first is that there's this other study that I found phenomenal, where it basically asks people to roll a dice, and it says if you roll a 6, you get more money. If you roll a 1, you get no money, right? So there's an incentive to lie about it. So there's variations of how many people cheat in this, basically. But what they found was that when they ran this study in corrupt countries, like in India, where being a civil servant is somewhere where you can get off the books pay.
Yep.
What happened was the people who lied about their dice rolls were disproportionately likely to want to become civil servants. They did this at a school. If you do the exact same study in somewhere like Denmark, it's exactly the opposite. The people who report their scores completely honestly, they're the ones who want to go into public service. So a corrupt system draws in corrupt people, and a clean system draws in clean people. So the system really, really matters. I talk about this actually in an essay I have out in The Atlantic today with policing in the United States. So there's this phenomenon that I think doesn't get enough attention when we talk about body cameras and trying to change what the police do with police reforms. And we have to think about who the police are and who wants to become a police officer. So, I looked at this ad that was used for recruitment in Doraville, Georgia, this town of 10,000 people outside Atlanta. And it's a caricature, right? It's literally like these guys in a tank driving through in the sort of, the Punisher logo is flashing on screen about vigilante justice. They throw smoke grenades out. That's the image of policing. I talked to New Zealand's police force, and they basically tried to counteract this. So they ran a multi-year recruitment scheme that used funny videos, made policing look enjoyable, all about public service, had lots of women and ethnic minorities in it. And their applications shot through the roof for non-traditional officers, right. And their abuse levels fell at the same time. So, I think that there's an acknowledgement we have to make that the way we perceive systems of power really, really matters for who seeks it. And it's why I'm particularly worried about what's happening in the U.S. right now with these insane zealots threatening school board members for mask mandates and so on, because they're making public service toxic, and they're going to ensure that good, decent people just simply self-select out of systems of power, and that we're left with the people who the insane zealots basically agree with putting their hat in the ring.
Right. You have that issue. You also have, it's not necessarily related to what we're talking about here, but I've pointed out that those who want to hurt public education funded through taxes love the school board stuff because they see it as, hey, if these schools seem really chaotic, it might encourage parents to say, I'm pulling my kid out. I'm going to do homeschooling, private school, whatever, which will, of course, further weaken schools and sort of exacerbate. Let's go back a little bit to the police thing, because that's interesting, and you've talked about that. There recently, two stories on policing have sort of come together. One is what was sort of increased by the George Floyd protests and questions of police brutality and bad apples that spoil the bunch, et cetera. We also have the anti-vaccine stuff, which is leading to, it really doesn't seem like more than 1% in the worst cases of officers leaving, 34 officers in New York City out of 36,000. A few emails that came in, people said, hey, when we talk about the bad apples that spoil the bunch on the police brutality stuff, it might be the same people who are now leaving because of the vaccine stuff. This could be a blessing in disguise, but that's not really a strategy for dealing with this issue of policing. What is your sense of, there's the reform movement, there's the defund movement, there's all these different ideas and approaches. You mentioned one in New Zealand that was a very different approach. How should we be thinking about, big picture, the issue of policing in the United States and who is doing the policing?
Yeah, so the stuff I talked about in New Zealand is a first step, which is to say you need to make the police appealing to normal, decent people who want to serve the public that don't have a military background, right? Veterans are overrepresented in the police dramatically in the U.S. by design, by the way. And that's not necessarily a problem. It's just that, if you think that your job is the same as when you were patrolling Fallujah when you're in Ferguson, right, that's going to be an issue. You're going to be more likely to be a little trigger happy and so on. And we need a lot more community officers that have no background in the military and actually don't want power. So the recruitment is part of it. There's other stuff I write about in the book that's about how you sort of deter abuses for people once they're in power. I think it is easier to recruit good apples than it is to make bad apples behave better. But we do have bad apples in the police. So what are we going to do? One of the keys is rotation. So there's a lot of studies that look at how comfort and sort of closed systems create abuse. So in police, for example, this is the sort of blue wall of silence and the sort of your partner will always have your back, even if you're doing something really illegal and abusive. So the Metropolitan Police in London, for example, did some work of rotating partners through regularly, and it had really good results. And there's also loads of psychological research where you have participants play games, basically, in which they can collude in order to win money. And if you work with the same person through multiple rounds of the game, the odds that you're going to try to give bribes to win the game go massively through the roof compared to if you're constantly rotating people through, because you have, this sort of fresh face that you don't know is necessarily on your side. And interestingly, this data shows the same thing, whether they run it in Germany or China or the US. So, I have at the end of the book, there's this section on 10 ways to fix the problem. And they're basically things that all need to happen because there's no silver bullet. This is a massive problem. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that we don't think about systems of power enough this way. We have to design every single system from the police to politics with the assumption, which is true, by the way, that bad people are disproportionately likely to seek power, disproportionately likely to get it, and disproportionately likely to be able to stay in it longer than they should. And so once you take that as the starting point, then you redesign the system and think, how can we invert that? And I think nothing has been tried. I mean, that's the thing that I find so maddening is that all of the debates around police, I mean, there's some defund movements and so on that have their ideas about, fundamentally transforming policing, but the rest of them, body cameras, I mean, it's a good idea, but is that really going to solve the problem? There's 1,000 people who are getting killed by cops in the United States every year. In New Zealand, there's about a dozen a decade, right? Maybe less than that. So obviously the population is different, but we have a massive, massive problem on our hands. And I don't think around the edges reforms are going to solve it.
What are the different fields in which these dynamics are a problem? I mean, I think police is one that gets a lot of attention. Politicians and psychopathy predispositions is sometimes talked about. I think corporate CEOs is one that gets discussion. We don't hear about this dynamic among postal workers or nurses, for example. So like what are the other fields where these dynamics show up more?
Well, it's very interesting you asked that because there's two sections in the book where I try to bring this dynamic much closer to home. And there's one which is a really crazy story about this guy named Steve Rauchi, who was a psychopathic custodian in Schenectady, New York. And in order to rise through the ranks in his school district, did some crazy stuff. I mean, he started using explosives and he's in jail for a very long time now. And that job, that was just a personality trait. So that's, if you have a psychopath who's power hungry, you put them in anywhere and they're going to try to rise through the ranks through any means necessary. But there's actually, as you say, a trait to this that is disproportionately selecting in certain jobs. So politics is an obvious one, but also one that's really interesting is a place where you have power for the sake of power with no real other benefits. So I explore this with homeowners associations. There's a great series of stories that I've discovered and characters that are very interesting people who basically, it's like this horrible job where you spend your time trying to impose fines on somebody down the block who put their bin out, 10 minutes too early or something on a Sunday. Who's that going to appeal to when the pay is either non-existent or terrible? Well, it's the person who's power hungry and can't fulfill that in another area of life. So those types of positions are also magnets for power abusers, which is why you get what we call the petty tyrant effect of the person who rules over a completely insignificant domain, but is going to abuse every possible ounce of power that they have. And I think that's something that a lot of people experience in their daily lives.
As a general rule, are the approaches that are more likely or have worked more effectively about, as you mentioned with police, it's hire good apples rather than convert? Does that apply universally?
Yeah, you sort of need to do all of the above, to be honest, because the problem is not just the individual, it's also the system, right? I mean, if you have a good person who goes into a rotten police department, they're going to probably behave in a rotten way. And one of the more unusual things that I did that might be of interest to your viewers and listeners is I took a ski lesson with Paul Bremer, who ran Iraq in 2003, and now he's a ski instructor in Vermont, believe it or not. So he's an interesting case study because, a lot of people see him as the villain, and I understand completely why. I mean, what he did in 2003, the record speaks for itself. But what's interesting about him is that he was previously an ambassador to Malawi and Norway, and it appears that he did a very good job. I mean, most people think that he was really effective and sort of had lots of integrity in that position and so on. And then he goes into Iraq where everything is broken and he's basically, a de facto viceroy of a dictatorship. And all of a sudden, everything he has to do is these awful decisions with morally dubious consequences and so on. And so I think one of the things that we also have to acknowledge is not to absolve people who do bad things in positions of power. It's that it's more complicated sometimes than it initially appears. And that the system also needs our attention because, I like to think that I would behave well no matter what, but you see the evidence from around the world, and you take people and put them in new systems, and they do behave in different ways. There's a study of bankers in Italy, where southern Italy is known as being more corrupt than northern Italy.
Yes.
And the employees who move between the same bank but different branches start embezzling at higher rates if they're in the south. So, there's things like that where we can see that it's both the individual and the system that need our attention.
This may seem like a sort of divergence, but I think it could be an interesting one. The role of power within other species, within the animal kingdom. What do we know that mirrors Homo sapiens, and what differences are there?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the most enjoyable parts of the research because, I'm a political scientist, so I don't spend a lot of time with people who study hyenas and bees and primates and so on, but I did for the book.
Yeah.
And it was really, really fascinating. Primates are a great window for us because it's similar in terms of some of the brain functions and some social structures without the culture, right? And so you can look at how power affects individuals. There's an amazing study. I interviewed a professor and doctor out in North Carolina who looks at hierarchy and drug addiction in macaque monkeys. Mm-hmm. And one of the craziest things is that when you basically give monkeys, you put them in groups of 4, they instantly form a hierarchy from 1 to 4. And then you offer them the choice between cocaine, where they push a button and they get intravenous cocaine, or banana pellets. They push a different button and they get banana pellets. And what's amazing about this is that every time you run this study, the top 2 monkeys, the ones that are on the top of the hierarchy, don't take the cocaine. They take the banana pellets. The ones who are on the bottom basically self-medicate. And this happens even if the alpha male in this group gets reassigned to another group of 4 and then ends up on the bottom, all of a sudden the exact same thing happens. So it doesn't matter about the individual. I also looked at corruption in, believe it or not, bees and wasps. And it's an amazing story about systems and individual behavior. I won't go into the whole story, but basically the gist of it is the way the hive is set up between different kinds of species of wasps, whether it's transparent or not, whether it's easy to detect wrongdoing or not by what are actually called police wasps or police bees, that has a massive, massive effect on how selfish the behavior of the individual wasp or bee is. And I think these lessons that we have from the animal kingdom are actually quite instructive because most of the time when we talk about these problems, we're talking about them within the silos of Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's worth stripping that away and saying, okay, there's some universal lessons that we can learn, and we might as well draw them from wherever we can, even if it's from an unexpected place.
That's super interesting. Yeah. And not that long ago, I read Jared Diamond's book, The Third Chimpanzee, which also talks a lot about sort of the parts that are analogous and parts that are not between humans and chimpanzees. And there's a lot of different layers to that you don't really see if the focus is like American partisan politics, I guess is the point that you're making.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some problems in society that actually can be solved, right? I mean, I think we focus on so much stuff that is the partisan battle of the day, which makes complete sense.
Yeah.
But we can actually make systems of power behave better for all of us. And that requires some outside the box thinking that might have reference points that aren't our typical culture wars.
Right.
It's hard to get worked up about somebody making a point about wasp corruption, for example. It's not exactly going to rile you up
in the same way.
Yeah. Wasps and so on. So I think we can draw these lessons. The other point that I make, by the way, is as part of the research for this book, I met with lots of really awful people. I met with lots of former despots, war criminals, all sorts around the world. And one of the points that I often make is you would find it super weird if somebody who was an expert on hyenas never encountered a hyena, never studied one, never went up to one and observed it. And yet there's a lot of stuff in politics where these monsters among us still are living, breathing, and willing to talk to people. So I went to study them to figure out what makes them tick and what power does to them. And I think that we need to do more of that because these problems are preventable, but we have to sort of strip away some of the sort of preconceptions or revulsion that we have and start to think, okay, we're stuck with some of these people. How can we make them behave better? How can we replace them? How can we make sure that better people follow them? And that requires some sort of outside the partisan frame thinking, I think.
The book is Corruptible: Who Gets Power and How It Changes Us. We've been speaking with the book's author, Brian Klaas. Brian, so great talking about this and always really appreciate your time.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
If you value what we do at The David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind the scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show, as well as special discounts on merch, including hats, hoodies, mugs, and t-shirts. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
All right, let's get through a couple other things, including a correction. I'm going to apologize for something I said on the, I think it was Monday show, which was wrong, but I'll get to that. I want to look at an interview that was done last night on Fox News. Donald Trump's son, I was going to say Donald Trump's former son, former President Donald Trump's son, Eric Trump, still his son as far as we know, appeared on Fox News last night. And he said a lot of things that don't make any sense. It was a humiliating interview. It was another one of these face plants where why does nobody go up to him and say, sir, these interviews aren't making you look particularly good. I'm sure he thinks this makes him look great. But let's just jump right into it. The first clip is based on the results of Virginia. And the context here is really interesting. I mentioned on Monday that win or lose in Virginia, Donald Trump is going to claim that he was in the right and he sort of won on Virginia in the sense that Trump endorsed Youngkin, but Youngkin did not embrace Trump's endorsement. So I predicted if Youngkin loses, Trump will say, it's not really a loss for me because I endorsed him, but he didn't embrace it. He didn't accept it. And if Youngkin wins, Trump will say, this is part of my great track record on endorsements, which is not so good. And we'll get to that in a second. Eric Trump playing right into this and saying, Virginia was a great night for Trump. He's not even pretending that it's about anything else for him.
Yeah. What a great night this was for the U.S. and what a great night it was for, frankly, Trump.
But it's interesting because your dad did endorse Youngkin. Your dad's track record is probably second to nobody when it comes to...
Yeah, it's actually not a great record. Trump likes to say, I'm 150-2 or whatever on endorsements. You can look this stuff up. Trump's endorsements are widely documented. In the 2018 midterms, Trump endorsed 75 candidates and a little more than half of them won. 42 of the 75 won. That's 55%. That's not that great, particularly when you consider that most endorsements are incumbents. And there's a big bias to success with endorsements because they're already in office and incumbency has a huge advantage. During Trump's presidency overall, from 2017 to 2021, Trump endorsed 305 people. And then after leaving, Trump endorsed 49 people. That's a total of 354 endorsements. Overall, Trump's somewhere between 65 and 75%. And again, there's a bias to success because you mostly endorse incumbents and incumbents usually win. So it's not really that great of a track record, but I guess maybe no one's fact checking it. Even Trump over the weekend said to Jeanine Pirro, I think I'm 140 something and 2 or something like that. Jeanine Pirro doesn't say a word about it. She may not know, she may not care. Okay, let's continue. Here we go into the supply chain stuff. And with the supply chain stuff, they're not even pretending that Christmas is about anything other than gifting cheap Chinese goods to people. It's going to ruin Christmas that Chinese goods are stuck on ships. Here's Eric Trump.
That's right, because he's an exciting guy, and most politicians, quite frankly, aren't. And my father finally brought some practicality and a sense of realism to politics that had never existed before. And you compare that to Joe Biden right now, who, while kids' Christmas presents are sitting on ships outside the port of LA because they can't get ships into our ports in this country and they have all sorts of problems, right?
Yeah.
While that's happening, Joe Biden's over in Glasgow falling asleep at climate summits, right? That has to tell you everything you need to know about a politician.
Now, again, that doesn't really have to do with Joe Biden. There were supply chain issues under Trump and there are supply chain issues now. Nobody was blaming Trump Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao last year, but now they're blaming Pete Buttigieg. They weren't blaming Trump, but now they're blaming Biden. But the bigger story for me is are we just admitting Christmas is actually about cheap Chinese goods brought over on container ships? Like, there's not even a pretense that that's not really the most important part of Christmas. I don't celebrate Christmas. I don't know. But I always thought that at least some people who celebrate Christmas said it was about something else, that the spirit of Christmas was not cheap Chinese goods stuck on ships. Okay, continuing the supply chain stuff, Eric Trump says, you can't get heating oil and you can't get gasoline anymore.
Every product is getting more and more expensive. You can't get PVC at a hardware store because we're not getting it in this country. I mean, just the basic problems this country has: heating oil, gasoline, everything. You can't get it.
You can't get everything anymore, guys. I don't know if he thinks this makes him look good, but it doesn't. And then lastly, Eric Trump, even channeling Trump now with the verbal slips, referring to lieutenant governor as lieutenant, which is, I kind of like lieutenant.
And we just have an unbelievable night, not just with governor, not just with lieutenant governor,
Lieutenant.
not with
Lieutenant governor. I like. Okay. All right, guys. So that's that. Eric Trump completely humiliating himself. All right. When I make a mistake on the show, and it's more than just, some kind of minor thing, I want to make sure I come to you and I say, sirs and ma'ams, I made a mistake and I want to correct the record. On Monday, I talked about the Glasgow Climate Change Summit and the outrage over 400 private jets flying there, and the irony and hypocrisy of let's fix climate and let's talk about it by flying in on our private jets, which on a per person basis, the carbon expenditures are off the charts. And I said a lot of different things in that segment, including that rich people are going to keep using private jets and that the economics of private jets just makes sense for CEOs and other dignitaries when you account all different factors. Eventually, private jets can run on renewable fuels and they're not going away. And that the real problem is that this is a distraction, sort of like change your straw and recycle at home. I said this is a distraction from the fact that 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all emissions. That was not accurate. And I actually got an email from Samuel about this. The article that I put up on the screen is a Guardian article from 4 years ago. It's been widely shared, and it says 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions. A small number of fossil fuel producers and their investors could hold the key to tackling climate change. This is not representative of the truth. Okay, this has actually been looked at. I'm glad to be corrected. You can check out the Snopes article about it. It's misleading in the following sense. What the actual data is that within the universe of fossil fuel producers, 71% of the pollution from fossil fuel producers comes from just 100 companies. It doesn't account for all sorts of other types of companies that also pollute. So when I said 100 companies are responsible for 71% of pollution, that's within fossil fuel producers, coal, gas, drilling, etc. It doesn't account for everything. The analysis is still the same. The analysis is still there are corporations that pollute either directly by mining fossil fuels or indirectly through their business models that would love it for the attention to be on, did you recycle every milk carton or not? Are you still using a plastic straw? Rather than the significant industrial pollution that they contribute to. So the analysis is the same, but that statistic, 100 companies contribute to 71% of all pollution? No, it's within fossil fuels, within the fossil fuel industry. 71% of that pollution comes from 100 fossil fuel producers. I'm sorry. The analysis is the same, but it would have been stronger had I not cited that, and I'm going to do better in the future. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. One of the things that bothers me the most about the ignorance that pervades our society is when people call in and they criticize me for things I haven't said, for points I haven't actually made. Criticize me for things I've said and do it factually, and then we'll have a good conversation. The San Antonio troll is someone who makes a habit of this. He calls in all the time, and he often will criticize me for things I didn't say. Sometimes it's things maybe from other shows that he watched. And in this case, he criticizes me for saying India Walton would have won if she had been more of a socialist. I never said that. I'm not a socialist. I don't believe running as more of a socialist would have helped her. But that's still what I'm getting criticized for. Take a listen to this. It's sad.
Pac-Man, I started to call again, man. You know who this is. It's just, you don't even have to play it. I just needed to get my voice to you. My mind is blown listening to your video, dude. Like, your take was India Walton losing the Buffalo Motor Race. Your take is that these candidates aren't socialist enough. She lost to a right-in candidate. Like, and your take is, oh, they need to be more socialism. Like, bro.
I never said that. I never said that. I don't even know where he could have gotten it. Did someone else say it? I don't really watch other shows like mine, but did one of my colleagues say that India Walton would have won if she had been more socialist? It's just not my analysis. Criticize me for things I've said. Let's listen to a little bit more.
Dude, it's time to, like, just, I get it. These opinions, like hating the father, hating the flag, hating the family, hating the police, hating capitalism.
It has to be talking about some other show, right?
Hating the big corporation. I understand these are very popular opinions on, like, Twitter, Reddit, and Discord, and YouTube even. But look, man, it just doesn't win elections, dude. People are like, hey, I love my family. I don't want to...
Go talk to someone who's actually making these claims. That would be my advice to the San Antonio troll. We've got a great bonus show for you today. There is one Republican senator ready to vote to move forward with debating a major Democratic voting rights bill, and that's Lisa Murkowski. One Republican senator. We'll talk about that. Number two, the American Psychological Association is now apologizing for previously perpetuating systemic racism. What did they do? We'll talk about it. Is their apology substantial? We will talk about it. And lastly, Colorado hospitals are now in a position where they may need to turn patients away because of a resurgence in COVID cases, and they are going to be allowed to do it. We're going to talk about all of those stories and more on today's bonus show, which you can get instant access to by becoming a member at joinpacman.com. If you'd rather do the pledge via Patreon, that will also get you access to the bonus show. You can go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Producer Pat will join me. Great bonus show. Otherwise, we will be back tomorrow with another show.
Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. Blinkist is the app that helps you become a more well-rounded person by letting you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try it for free and get 25% off a subscription by going to Blinkist.com/David Pakman.